to another spooky edition of Chapter Book Readings with me, Molly. Since tomorrow is Halloween, I'm going to turn the lights down a little bit to read this next chapter of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark to make it a little bit more spookier for you. Alright, so let's read this next scary chapter of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And this chapter is titled, They Eat Your Eyes, They Eat Your Nose. There are many scary stories about all kinds of things. The ones told here are about a grave, a witch, a man who liked to swim, a hunting trip, and a market basket. There also is one about worms eating a corpse. Your corpse. And here is a creepy illustration right here. Looks like a coffin with a bony hand sticking out. This first short story is titled The Hearse Song. And it looks a little bit more like a poem. And it also has some musical notes if you want to play the song, if you know how to play an instrument and can read music. Alright, it goes, Don't you ever laugh as the hearse goes by, for you may be the next to die. They wrap you up in a big white sheet from your head down to your feet. They put you in a big black box and cover you up with dirt and rocks. All goes well for about a week. Then your coffin begins to leak. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. The worms play pinochle on your snout. They eat your eyes, they eat your nose. They eat the jelly between your toes. A big green worm with rolling eyes crawls in your stomach and out your eyes. Your stomach turns a slimy green, and pus pours out like whipping cream. Gross. You spread it on a slice of bread, and that's what you eat when you are dead. All right, that was creepy and gross. All right, this next one is called The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. And there is a picture of a gravestone, and there's a knife sticking into the ground, it looks like. Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. Don't ever stand on a grave after dark, one of the boys said. The person inside will grab you. He'll pull you under. That's not true, one of the girls said. It's just a superstition. I'll give you $1 if you stand on a grave, said the boy. A grave doesn't scare me, said the girl. I'll do it right now. The boy handed her his knife. Stick this knife in one of the graves, he said. Then we'll know you were there. The graveyard was filled with shadows and was as quiet as death. There's nothing to be scared of, the girl told herself, but she was scared anyway. She picked out a grave and stood on it. Then quickly she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil, and she started to leave. But she couldn't get away. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time to leave, but she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. Something's got me, she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her shirt and had pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that held her. She had died of fright. Oh, she died of fright, man. That must have been really scary. This one is called A New Horse, and there's an illustration of what looks like a woman on a horse running really fast through a spooky scene right there. Two farmhands shared a room. One slept at the back of the room, the other slept near the door. After a while, the one who slept near the door began to feel very tired early in the day. His friend asked what was wrong. An awful thing happens every night, he said. A witch turns me into a horse and rides me all over the countryside. I'll sleep in your bed tonight, his friend said. We'll see what happens to me. About midnight, an old woman who lived nearby came into the room. She mumbled some strange words over the farmhand, and he found he couldn't move. Then she slipped a bridle on him, and he turned into a horse. The next thing he knew, she was riding him across the fields at breakneck speed, beating him to make him go even faster. Soon they came to a house where a party was going on. There was a lot of music and dancing. They were having a big time inside. She hitched him to a fence and went in. While she was gone, the farmhand rubbed against the fence until the bridle came off, and he turned back into a human being. Then he went into the house and found the witch. He spoke those strange words over her, and with the bridle he turned her into a horse. Then he rode her to a blacksmith and had her fitted with horseshoes. After that, he rode her to the farm where she lived. "I have a pretty good filly here," he told her husband, "but I need a stronger horse. Would you like to trade?" The old man looked over her, and he said he would do it. So they picked out another horse, and the farmhand rode away. Her husband led his new horse to the barn. He took off the bridle and went to hang it up. But when he came back, the new horse was gone. Instead, there stood his wife with horseshoes nailed to her hands and feet. Ouch. This next one is titled Alligators. And there's an illustration of some alligators swimming in probably a lake or a swamp. A young woman in town married a man from another part of the country. He was a nice fellow, and they got along pretty well together. There was only one problem. Every night he'd go swimming in the river. Sometimes he would be gone all night long, and she would complain about how lonely she was. This couple had 2 young sons, and as soon as the boys could walk, their father began to teach them how to swim. And when they got to be old enough, he took them swimming in the river at night. Often they would stay there all night long, and the young woman would stay home all by herself. After a while, she began to act in a strange way. At least that is what the neighbors said. She told them that her husband was turning into an alligator, and that he was trying to turn the boys into alligators. Everybody told her there was nothing wrong with a man taking his son swimming. That was a natural thing to do. And when it came to alligators, there weren't any nearby. Everybody knew that. Early one morning, the young woman came running into town from the direction of the river. She was soaking wet. She had a big alligator, and 2 little alligators had pulled her in and had tried to get her to eat a raw fish. They were her husband and her sons, she said, and they wanted her to live with them, but she had gotten away. Her doctor decided she had lost her mind, and he had her put in the hospital for a while. After that, nobody saw her husband and boys again. They just disappeared. But now and then a fisherman would tell about seeing alligators in the river at night. Usually it was 1 big alligator and 2 small ones. But people said they were just making it up. Everybody knows there weren't any alligators around here. Well, apparently there are. They turned into alligators. That's creepy. All right, this one is called Room for One More. And it looks like an illustration of an old elevator, where it tells you what floor you're going on to. That's what an older elevator would have looked like at the top, where it shows you where you're going to the top floor or down to the bottom floor. A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night they had a good time visiting, but when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car run into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse, looked up at him. When Blackwell saw his queer, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him, "There is room for one more." Then he waited for a minute or 2, and he drove off. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "I must have been," he said, "but it didn't seem like a dream." After breakfast, he went into Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of the new office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him back down to the street, but when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him. "There's room for one more," he said. It was the driver of the hearse. "No thanks," said Blackwell. "I'll get the next one." The doors closed and the elevator started down. There was a shrieking and screaming, then the sound of a crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone aboard was killed. Ah, that's really dark. So here's an illustration of what looks like ghost people on the elevator. And there's that thing on the top of the elevator again. It shows them what floor they're going down or up to. Okay, and then we have a couple more here, like a few more. This one is called the Wendigo. And if you've never heard of a Wendigo, they're a mythical, scary creature. Sometimes they lurk in graveyards. They're really creepy creatures, if you've ever heard of them before. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people had ever hunted. He traveled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him. But no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. Finally, he found an Indian who needed money badly, and he agreed to take him. The Indian's name was Defago. They made camp in the snow near a large frozen lake. For 3 days they hunted, but they had nothing to show for it. The third night a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent listening to the wind howling and the trees whipping back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened the tent flap. What he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air stirring, and the trees were standing perfectly still. Yet he could hear the wind howling, and the more he listened, the more it sounded as if it were calling Defago's name. Defago. Okay, I was pronouncing his name wrong. Defago, it called. I must be losing my mind, the hunter thought, but Defago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was huddled in a corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. What's this all about? The hunter asked. It's nothing, Defago said. But the wind continued to call to him, and Defago became more tense and more restless. Defago, it called. Defago. Suddenly he jumped to his feet and he began to run from the tent, but the hunter grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground. You can't leave me out here, the hunter shouted. Then the wind called again, and Defago broke loose and ran into the darkness. The hunter could hear him screaming as he went. Again and again he cried, "Oh, my fiery feet, my burning feet of fire!" Then his voice faded away and the wind died down. At daybreak, the hunter followed Defago's tracks in the snow. They went through the woods down toward the lake, then out onto the ice. But soon he noticed something strange. The steps Defago had taken got longer and longer. They were so long no human being could have taken them. It was as if something had helped him to hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out to the middle of the lake, but there they disappeared. At first he thought that Defago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought that something had pulled him off the ice into the sky, but that made no sense. As he stood wondering what had happened, the wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as it had the night before. Then he heard Defago's voice. It was coming from up above, and again he heard Defago screaming. "My fiery feet! My burning feet!" But there was nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to camp and packed. Then he left some food for Defago and he started out. Weeks later he reached civilization. The following year he went back to hunt in that area again. He went to the same trading post to look for a guide. The people there could not explain what had happened to Defago that night, but they had not seen him since then. "Maybe it was the Wendigo," one of them said, and he laughed. "It's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away, and more of you than that. Then it carries you into the sky and it drops you. It's just a crazy story, but that's what some of the Indians say." A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. An Indian came in and sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around him, and he wore his hat so that you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and asked, "Are you Defago?" The Indian didn't answer. Do you know anything about him? No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong, if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. Are you all right? He asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the Indian's hat. Then he screamed. There was nothing under the hat but a pile of ashes. Oof, that was scary. All right, so I think this is the second to last one, called The Dead Man's Brains. And there's an illustration of someone having their hands in a bowl that's wrapped with a sheet. And I wonder if there's brains in it. I guess we'll find out. This scary story is a scary game that people play at Halloween, but it can't be played whenever the spirit moves you. The players sit in a circle in a darkened room and listen to a storyteller describe the rotting remains of a corpse. Each part is passed around for them to feel. In one version, a player is out if he or she screams or gasps with fright. In another version, everybody stays to the end, no matter how scared they get. Here's the story. Once in this town, there lived a man named Brown. It was years ago on this night that he was murdered out of spite. We have here his remains. First, let's feel his brains. A wet, squishy tomato is what it actually was. Now, here are his eyes, still frozen with surprise. 2 peeled grapes. This is his nose, a chicken bone. Here is his ear, a dried apricot. And here is his hand, rotting flesh and bone, a cloth or rubber glove filled with mud or ice. But his hair still grows, a handful of corn silk or wet fur yarn. And his blood still flows. Dip your fingers in it, it's nice and warm. It's actually a bowl of ketchup thinned with warm water. That's all there is except for these worms. They are the ones that ate the rest of him. It was actually a handful of wet, cooked spaghetti noodles. So if you ever want to trick your friends, you could use some food or something that's fake, not actual body parts, of course, but that might be a creepy, fun little game on Halloween. All right, this one is called May I Carry Your Basket? And there's an illustration of a woman in a darkened alleyway underneath a street light, and she's carrying a basket. Sam Lewis spent the evening playing chess at his friend's house. It was about midnight when they finished their game, and he started home. Outside it was icy cold and as quiet as the grave. As he came around a turn in the road, he was surprised to see a woman walking ahead of him. She was carrying a basket covered with a white cloth. When he caught up to her, he looked to see who it was. But she was so bundled up against the cold, it was hard to see her face. Good evening, Sam said. What brings you out so late? But she didn't answer. Then he said, May I carry your basket? She handed it to him. From under the cloth, a small voice said, That's very nice of you. And that was followed by wild laughter. Sam was so startled that he dropped the basket, and out rolled a woman's head. He looked at the head and he stared at the woman. It's her head, he cried. And he started to run, and the woman and her head began to chase him. Soon the head caught up to him. It bounded into the air and sunk its teeth into his left leg. Sam screamed with pain and ran faster. But the woman and her head stayed right behind. Soon the head leaped into the air again and bit into his other leg. They were gone. That was kind of a creepy twist on a headless horseman type of thing. But instead of a headless horseman, it's a headless older woman, whose head likes to bite people. So that was really scary. So I hope that you have enjoyed our scary stories to read in the dark readings. I hope I didn't scare you too bad on some of these stories, but I hope that if you didn't, that you enjoyed them and that you'll share them with your friends. So tune in next week for a different book that we're going to start reading for November. So stay tuned for that and have a great weekend.